Welcome to another Faith on the Record, where we shine the light of faith on the headlines that are making the stories of the day. I'm Nick Stuart, president of Odyssey Networks, and today there's just one question. After months and months of relentless campaigning, we now know the result of the election. But what does that say about America today? And especially, what does it say about faith in America? To unpack that, we've got a panel of the wise, the great, and the good. And they're going to introduce themselves. Jim, let's start with you.
Jim Wallis, I'm with Sojourners, and I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C.
Thanks, Jim. And Elizabeth?
I'm Liz Tenety. I'm editor of On Faith, which is the Washington Post forum for news and opinion about religion and politics. I'm also sitting in Washington.
There's a lot to talk about, obviously, the way faith and the faith communities related to the vote and how they voted. But I want to start off with a general question to you both. What's your takeaway from it all?
Clearly, this was an election about the economy. And there was always questions throughout the campaign, where do religious voters fit in? And in particular, people were wondering, what about the religious right, the social conservative movement? And that's a question today. That's my big takeaway. That's my big question right now. What happens to the religious right? David Gibson from Religion News Service has a piece that's up now at On Faith, and it doesn't look too good. I think the biggest takeaway, the most important question that I have to ask those who are advocating against abortion, those who are opposed to same-sex marriage, is the battle going to move from the political front to the cultural front? And I am starting to see people ask that question because they are now losing. There's a series of losses, and what does that mean? If you can't win politically, where do you shift? And finally, I'm now seeing more evangelicals than before. I think after the election talk about, and this I'm talking about conservative Christians, talk about religious freedom in the same way that the Catholic Church has been ratcheting up that area of concern. I think what I'm seeing is people moving away from advocating for their unpopular positions to saying, okay, we have to protect this sphere around us. Our beliefs are unpopular. Maybe what we need to do now is make sure that we can live them out to the fullest instead of necessarily advocating unpopular things in the public square.
So it's almost as though the rules of the game that have been in play for the last 2 or 3 elections have changed with this one. I mean, that's huge. I mean, Jim, from your perspective, what do you think the people said in this election? What is the takeaway we have?
Chuck Todd, who's my favorite analyst with NBC, he said it all. He said, a demographic time bomb has gone off in American politics. That, to me, is the major takeaway. You can no longer win elections in America if your voters are mostly white and male and older. You just won't win elections. And even the conversation about evangelicals is an old conversation. When the media says evangelicals, they mean white evangelicals. Well, you got the black church is evangelical. The Hispanic church is evangelical. They are part of the evangelicals now, and they voted overwhelmingly for Barack Obama. But they don't have the narrow view that to be pro-life means to only care about abortion. They care about immigration, about how we welcome the stranger, about the poor. They have a more biblical view than the religious right has ever had about what Christians ought to care about in elections.
So Jim, the religious right for 3-4 elections really has been their game plan, to build around those issues, those value-based issues in relation to abortion, marriage, etc. What do you think the leaders of the religious right are saying today? What's going through their heads?
I hope they know they're in serious trouble. I mean, I would put it this way. Let me be specific. Very strident partisan efforts by Franklin Graham and Ralph Reed to narrow everything down to abortion and gay marriage failed miserably. That's evident and significant. So the religious right now just can't win elections when they narrow the concerns of people of faith down to 2 issues, because many of the people of color who voted for Barack Obama also think abortion is a moral issue. but they don't think it's the only moral issue. And so you're going to see a broader, more biblical vision now of how Christians ought to be voting than we've had for a long time. The religious right is a political movement trying to win Republicans to public life. And, you know, they just don't have the votes. It's a racial issue. You can't win elections now when you only have white people voting for you. You can't do it.
I was just going to pick up on that issue of race. And Elizabeth, turning to you as a journalist, how interesting does this make it for you now, this whole patch? Because, you know, looking at the way America voted, if you're white and male, you seem to have gone for the Republicans, but the rest, women and minorities, seem to have gone for the Democrats.
I think, I mean, it's huge. It's huge. And I think, as Jim said, people feel, it seems to me, what I'm seeing conservative leaders articulate is some concern that they may be on the losing end of the culture wars, what Ed Stetzer said from Lifeway Research. Beyond that, beyond race and looking at diversity that way, there was a Pew study that came out recently that I think we're finding to be really consequential in this election. So the unaffiliated, the growing rise of the unaffiliated, they are hugely associated with the Democrats. They're liberal-leaning, and unaffiliated, just to be clear, means that people don't say they belong to a specific church or identify with a particular religious denomination, but it doesn't mean that they're agnostic or atheist. Those are very, very small percentages of the population. But young people, 1 in 3 Americans under 30 is religiously unaffiliated. Those people are very supportive of gay marriage. They don't think abortion should be an issue for the public square. So in terms of the demographic shift, in terms of the trajectory of the country, I think the conservative activists, they're having a moment of reckoning because the demographics are simply not on their side. Even, as Jim said, among younger Christians, they define these issues much more broadly than their parents' generations. One of the things I'm going to be paying attention to is the emerging pragmatism, particularly in the Catholic Church. If they can't get anti-abortion rights people elected, then what happens to that movement? If gay marriage becomes legal, where are the new battlegrounds? And I think there's going to be a shift in where the resources are paid, and I think that's why we're seeing the emergence of this battle for religious freedom over those specific issues.
I mean, is there an internal battle going on within religion, a sort of orthodoxy versus the rest, the authority within and the hierarchy within those denominations versus the rest? Something has changed because the Roman Catholic bishops seem to lead a charge against Obama, and yet Obama won the Catholic vote.
Sure, but I think if you open the Catholic vote up a little bit, there is some interesting information in there. So Romney did gain a larger percentage of the white Catholic vote than Republicans did in 2008. The Hispanic Catholic vote overwhelmingly went for President Obama in this election. So I think you're seeing people perhaps paying attention to different issues within the Catholic Church. You did see nearly 60% of Catholics voting for Romney, 60% of white Catholics voting for Romney. So I do think that perhaps on the margins, maybe not overwhelmingly, but over time, hearing your religious leaders bring this issue up over and over again, I do think it has an influence. On the flip side, I think the Church, and I speak from my own background as a Catholic, I think the Church does need to be careful in obviously overly politicizing the faith. And I wonder, I mean, clearly there's already been a backlash against that, but mostly among more partisan people inside the Catholic Church. So liberal Catholics, are revolting. That's where the nuns on the bus idea comes about. But, I'm sort of curious with Catholics in the middle, where are they going to find themselves with this overt politicization of their faith?
The issue of race is central here. I mean, the fact that Obama won the Catholic vote because of Hispanic Catholics. I also, Liz, want to look at Catholic women. I suspect that Obama did better with Catholic women, white Catholic women, than white Catholic men. So all the nuns on the bus didn't vote for Romney, but also they had an impact on a lot of other Catholics around the country. So what's interesting here is hierarchies. It's interesting. The leadership and the hierarchies of most of our churches are now coming in the direction of social justice, and they're defining life in a more consistent life way that isn't narrowly focused on abortion. The one exception to that is the Catholic hierarchy. They're moving in the other direction. But there are Catholic bishops still for whom defending the poor, our circle of protection is very important to them, the death penalty. But the hierarchy is moving toward a more narrowing of the issues, while the Catholic Church is widening their concerns about being pro-life. There's a conflict there between the hierarchy and the growing population of the Catholic Church. Among evangelicals, young evangelicals have been moving in the direction of justice for a long time. And young evangelicals still care about the sanctity of life. They're not for abortion. They're not Democrats on abortion. They are more open and tolerant on same-sex couples. So young evangelicals don't hear their parents on that. So there's tremendous demographic shifting here. And I think it's a very different world now for the religious right is not, the religious right's children are not joining the religious right. Some of them are now unaffiliated. Some of them are social justice Christians who don't agree with their parents' partisan and narrowing of the issues to abortion and gay marriage. They're losing their own kids.
I would just add to that that it's clear to me that in terms of the demographic shifting, the culture is changing. People are more tolerant. And for example, on gay marriage, it's just a specific issue that we can point to see the culture changing. And in terms of that tension between orthodoxy and progress, to put it that way, I am fascinated by, and I will be watching how these religious institutions that don't like progress, that think that truth doesn't evolve, how they engage with just a culture at large, particularly younger generations that think very differently.
Jim, the wider point about authority and leadership in faith groups, which Elizabeth brought up, how deeply do you think denominations will have to look at themselves now and the way the hierarchy talks and takes notice of the grassroots?
Well, you mentioned orthodoxy and hierarchy. The issue here isn't orthodoxy. Many of us as Christians would call ourselves, Orthodox. I'm an evangelical. I believe in the Bible. I believe in Jesus. And so young evangelicals and Black and Hispanic evangelicals are they're evangelical theologically. They're not theological liberals, for example. They're not. But they take that Bible and they don't see their Bible saying, let's just worry about abortion. They see 2,000 verses in the Bible about poor people. And that changes their view of election. So it's not a matter of orthodoxy or not. It's a matter of how we see the Bible. Now, leadership, though, is a different question. I see evangelical leadership moving in all the right directions on immigration reform, on poverty, on even war and peace. The NAE used to be National Association of Evangelicals, was an outpost of the religious right. Now they're partners with us in the circle of protection and the immigration reform table among evangelicals. That's a huge switch. So leadership is moving in our direction, except for the Catholic hierarchy, on all these matters.
So there's evolution going on there. One of the key factors maybe driving evolution, or certainly influencing it in this equation, we've touched on already, the Latino Hispanic vote. Far more influential this time, and in 4 years' time, who knows? People are really after and need that vote. Jim, you're an evangelical, progressive evangelical. What's your relationship like with the Hispanic evangelical group?
It's very close. We're talking every day right now about how in a new administration we're going to make immigration reform the first issue, the first question, the first test of the new administration and the Congress. The Republicans now are in a very vulnerable position. They lost this election in large part because they alienated Hispanic voters. So they are going to be much more open to immigration reform now than they were before the election. So we have to press the administration to show courage, which they didn't show in the first 4 years on this question, as they should have, and press Republicans to move away from the anti-immigrant posture in the primaries, I think we have a good chance of passing comprehensive immigration reform in the first few months of this new congressional session, because the faith community is united now, evangelicals, Catholic, and mainline, around welcoming the stranger. Jesus says, the way you treat the stranger is the way you treat me. And so we've been biblically converted, and now we have relationships with brothers and sisters who are undocumented. And that, in fact, as you know, the growth of the church in America, almost all, is immigrant population. So this is our future, it's our growth, it's our relationships, and it's what the Bible says. So we're going to see immigration reform passed, in large part due to the pressure of the faith community on the politicians who haven't been willing to show courage, and now maybe will in a new election situation.
So, Jim, that there's a mandate really from this vote, you feel, to the president to really push this immigration reform through.
It's the clearest mandate from the faith community. There's two. One is immigration reform. The other is protect poor and vulnerable people in the deficit and budget debates. In other words, we're working on poverty all the time. We're going to say now to them, don't make deficit decisions that increase poverty. You can't do that. So on those two questions, you're going to see a real unity in the faith community pressing the politics on both sides of the aisle.
Elizabeth, before we move on from the Latino-Hispanic topic, as a journalist, is that going to be the main area for you to look at and write about, you think, in the months to come?
It will be, particularly, again, with the Catholic Church. Again, I mean, I follow the church more closely as a Catholic, just seeing the difference in the pews and how even our traditions are evolving as immigrants come and bring new traditions to the church. The Catholic Church, for example, is very involved in immigration reform, but they haven't made it one of those issues like abortion that, in a way, they feel like voters should hinge their entire decision on it. That abortion is one issue that is crystallized in the church, but certainly they are very active. And in fact, I think they even look at the church's right to serve the undocumented worker as an issue of religious freedom, that they are including that in that advocacy they're doing for religious freedom. So yes, I mean, we're looking to where religion is changing and where it's growing, and of course, the Hispanic community, that is absolutely where the future is. So yes, we are paying attention.
And Jim's point about gathering the wagons around social justice and the poor, you think that's reflected in both sectors of the Latino group, the Catholic and the evangelical?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of questions being asked today on the Republican side. On what issues do they engage with the Latino vote? Many people believe that they are very strongly pro-family, want to strengthen marriage, and many are pro-life. So how can they build bridges on those issues? But absolutely, there's no doubt that the idea of self-deportation, that Texas and Governor Rick Perry created a magnet for immigrants. I mean, that's language that feels callous, and I think that really, had an impact in this election. And in many ways, the way that Republicans engage with our immigration issues is going to shape the future of that party, and there will likely be change, because there has to be a change in their approach.
Jim, I want to turn to you now and move on from these issues to a practical way of how things work now with church leaders, with faith leaders, and the politicians, and the people in the White House and the Oval Office. Within the first few weeks of a new president, or a president starting a new term, does he call in faith leaders? Have you been called into the Oval Office in the first few weeks to lay out a framework?
We don't wait to be called in. We tell them when we want a meeting. I mean, we have a relationship now. We're meeting with the Gang of Eight, all the senators who are going to be doing this deal on the Fiscal Cliff. We're meeting with the leaders on both sides of the aisle. We're meeting at the White House. We didn't meet at the White House last week before the election. We'll have one now right afterwards. No, the faith community doesn't wait to be called in for a prayer breakfast. We are engaging our political leaders on the moral issues that we think are critical for us. And so the two big ones right now are going to be the need for comprehensive immigration reform. We're in conversation already with the White House, Democrats, and Republicans on that issue and what's going to happen in the next few weeks and months, and the issue of the deficit and budgets and decisions that we're going to make about how to get to a fiscal sustainable path is important. Reducing a deficit is a moral issue. We're saying that, but how you do it is a moral issue as well. And to make the poor pay the most and sacrifice the most is not something that we will let happen. So we're already talking with them about those issues. We're not to wait and be called in. We have meetings already set.
I'm glad you brought up the issue of the fiscal cliff. I was going to come to that in a second. It is the most urgent thing, I think, on the president's desk at the moment. Already, Europe and the rest of the world is beginning to tremble at the prospect of this, and 300 points got wiped off the Dow yesterday around it. How do you see it, and what are you going to say to them when you sit down, and do you think they'll listen?
Well, they are listening. We're making an ask and an offer. The ask is, in your decision-making, you've got to respect our principle of the circle of protection, which is to protect poor and vulnerable people from having their lives made even more difficult. You've got to protect low-income people in your decision-making. That's our ask. Our offer is, if you make that principle clear and policies that back it up, we will throw our support toward the moral weight of our authority churches toward a path to fiscal sustainability. We will help you get to a fiscally responsible place, but not at the expense of the poorest and most vulnerable. So we're going to look at corporate welfare, if you will. This country subsidizes the wealthy much more than it does the poor. So that's where the money is. Pentagon spending is where the money is. The wealthy are not even paying the same proportion of their taxes that their employees are paying. So we're talking about fairness and justice and a path to fiscal sustainability that is both fair and just.
Jim, I wanted to ask you very quickly before I move on to Elizabeth on this one, but I remember once making a documentary. It was a Presbyterian church out in LA, and one of the people said to me, you know, the only problem with the gospel is Jesus didn't talk about the rich enough. And hearing you now and many leaders talk about the plight of the poor, if I'm a multimillionaire, I don't hear myself being mentioned, certainly in a positive light. So what is your theology of wealth? What do you reach out to the multimillionaires and engage with them on?
Well, Jesus actually does talk about wealth quite a bit, and the rich quite a bit. And he talks about what it means. I mean, in God's economy, two principles. There is enough if we share it. There is enough if we share it. And part of conversion, historically, was people who are wealthy turning over more and more of their wealth for the sake of the kingdom, the values of the gospel of the kingdom, and good news to the poor is at the heart of that. So I'm talking with CEOs and business people all the time, and they're wanting to embrace this issue of values, because particularly for people of faith, because the gospel is very clear about the common good means that we have to love our neighbors, especially those whom he calls, Jesus, the least of these. So the gospel is pretty clear about that. Matthew 25 couldn't be more clear as this, how you treat those who are, I was hungry, I was naked, I was thirsty, I was a stranger, I was sick, I was in prison. As you've done to them, you've done to me. And so that gospel is converting people, I think, across the country, up and down the economic spectrum. And that's what I want people to be shaped by, not just by voting as other white people do or other rich people do. I want Christians to act like Christians first. We're Christians first and everything else second. That's what I want to say to anybody, rich or poor. Christians first, everything else second.
Elizabeth, Jim's very clear, laying out his sort of manifesto, as it were, there, and clearly he's engaging with the politicians at the highest level. When you look to write stories in the next week or two with this fiscal cliff coming up, do you see religious leadership really standing up? Where would you look for that?
Interesting question. I'm reevaluating after the election. I mean, we definitely saw those ideas in a different way. I mean, clearly President Obama embraces this idea that we are our brother's keeper, that our job as Christians is to provide the most good for the most people. What I'm going to be looking at is how conservative Christians, just to give the other side, how they deal with these ideas in the post-election world. So we heard a lot about, especially during the Republican primaries, which I think helped bubble out some of these ideas as they relate to morality and the economy on the right. The idea, for example, that mandatory generosity isn't true Christian generosity. This is a theme that we saw echoed over and over again. Obviously, Romney and Ryan talking about the debt as a moral issue. So what I'm looking for is that religious language being used in our debates about the economy and the fiscal cliff. But really, I want to know how they're going to shift in the post-election world when, you know, they don't have anything more than they went in with. So where do they think that they can give on that? And the language specifically of morals and values that the right uses on this issue is what I'm going to be looking for.
So the whole language could change. Yeah.
Definitely. I think it can.
Now, we're almost out of time. One of the things we did here at Odyssey was go out on Twitter and invite questions for the both of you, and I've got time for just two of them. It's interesting, the economy clearly central to the election, clearly central to this debate between the three of us, and clearly central to the people following us on Twitter. Jim, the first question is for you. It's from a gentleman called Ken Fallon. He says, could you ask Reverend Wallis, how do we care for the least at the governmental level and remain fiscally responsible? Where's the wealth coming from?
The wealth is coming from where the money is. For example, I can be very specific. They want to cut from agriculture, and so right now they want to cut food stamps to working families who have kids and who have jobs and who need nutritional support. Instead of cutting subsidies to agribusiness and big farmers who don't need the money. So we're making choices here. Choices. Who are we choosing to sacrifice? And so, you know, I'm quite happy to have that debate. Who should you make sacrifice? A rice farmer who actually doesn't even farm but lives in Manhattan now in a very expensive home. Do they sacrifice, or are you going to cut the food stamps for a mom and 3 kids, and she's already working 2 jobs? These are not choices that we want to ever make explicit, and we're going to make them now very explicit. And we want faith to decide how we resolve those kinds of choices.
And you feel you can encourage the growth of wealth by bringing more people into work, into jobs?
Oh, we want jobs, sure. But what we're saying is the economy right now, most people think it isn't fair, isn't just. People want a fair shot, and people don't trust the way the economy and the political system have been rigged. This was the most expensive election in our history. And what's clear now is the checks have replaced all the balances in our public life. And that issue is going to be more and more in the forefront in the faith community.
Elizabeth, last question to you. It comes from Chris Horst. And Chris asks, is the growing burden of debt that we're placing on our children a vital justice issue? And so, as a journalist, I mean, do you see the faith groups asking that question enough, dynamically enough? And how are they answering it?
Interesting. Well, I definitely see conservatives talking about the debt as a moral issue. That, I think, was possibly necessary. It was a way for Romney to talk about, for example, his values without saying, by the way, I'm a Mormon, but talking about those common values. It's absolutely clear that dealing with the debt is not only something that the public is concerned about, but clearly that politicians are. Again, as a journalist, as a religion journalist, my eyes are looking for those words in terms of burden, moral responsibility, the common good. I'm looking for people who are explaining their economic decisions in moral terms, and I think we're going to see a lot of that in the days to come. But there's so much reevaluation that's going on right now, so I will let you know when we see it.
Liz is right to say, looking for the moral terminology. We say budgets are moral documents. So relieving a debt is a moral issue. How we do it is a moral choice. Who is made to pay for it are the questions that we're looking at in the faith community.
Jim, Elizabeth, thank you very much for your time and your insights. I do hope the President is watching Faith on the Record. There's some illuminating perspectives put on. So thank you for your time. Thanks everyone for watching. And until the next Faith on the Record, take care.